Welcome everyone to the first TAOS seminar of the semester. Before I forget, students, please sign the roster in the back, the seminar class, so forth. I want to get that on the table first. It's my pleasure today to introduce Brianne Smith here, who comes to us just down the road at Brooklyn College, CUNY. Brianne caught my attention with her work recently, given the flash flooding, which she's been working on for several years now. Just to give a little bit of background on her, she got her bachelor's degree in 2007 from Cornell in biological and environmental engineering, and also a master of engineering in agricultural and biological engineering, also at Cornell University. Then she went on to Princeton, worked with Jim Smith there, who some of us know. It does a lot of hydrologic work, and got her PhD in civil and environmental engineering just this past year in 2015 and so forth, and then got the position here at CUNY, Brooklyn College. So, as I mentioned, this is an important topic, and interestingly, not a lot of people are looking at urban hydrology. It's a difficult topic and so forth, and so that's why I wanted to invite Brianne here to talk to us about this issue, where she's been doing some work in Baltimore area and then thinking about the New York City area. So with that, let's welcome Brianne.
Great. Thanks for having me at Stony Brook, and thanks, Brian, for inviting me. I'm excited to come out here. It's my first time out here. So, as Brian said, I am from Brooklyn College, just, a couple-hour train ride away, so if anyone ever wants to come out, it's a pretty cool place. I study flash flooding in urban areas, and so my past work has always been in Baltimore, but now I'm looking to start working in New York since I've recently moved here. So I'll talk a little bit about my past work and then kind of interesting problems in New York City as well. But first, why is flash flooding such a big deal? It's kind of an overlooked problem that we have with kind of weather systems, natural hazards. So most of us who like flash flooding like to look at this chart, present this chart from the National Weather Service. And so this is showing fatalities from different natural hazards and weather issues. And so it's interesting, a lot of times we're really worried about, hurricanes, we're really worried about tornadoes. But if you look at 30-year averages, which is this yellow bar, more people actually die in flooding than die from tornadoes or hurricanes. The thing that actually beats flooding is heat waves, which is another thing not too many people think about, and another problem with urban areas in particular. So flooding is a really big problem, and actually the majority of these fatalities in floods come from flash flooding. People who drive through water that's rising, people who walk through water that's rising, things like that. So fatalities are a big issue and why I care about flash flooding. Another thing is that flash flooding can just, cause really bad health issues that aren't necessarily fatalities. And so this is a picture, a couple of pictures of a flood that happened just 2 weeks after I moved to Brooklyn. The Gowanus Canal, which many of you probably know is a super fun site in Brooklyn. It's really dirty water, not water you ever want to touch. Rose up out of the banks of the Gowanus Canal and covered huge parts of Gowanus. And so here you can see how deep it is based on this truck, which, as I was saying earlier, this is how people die in flash floods. You should never drive through water like this. You should never walk through water like this. And especially not Gowanus water, because you could probably get really bad infections just from walking through this water. So, there's a lot of health issues that come into play with this. There's a lot of property damage that comes into play with this. You can see this garage owner kind of pumping out his garage. So we have lots of problems with flash flooding. Now, urban areas are very prone to flash flooding. And so there's a couple reasons. The first one that we hear most commonly is there's a lot of impervious surfaces in urban areas. And so here's a picture near where I live, the Barclays Center. And you can look at this and see there's very few places that water can sink into the ground or infiltrate into the ground. Maybe there's like a planter here or something. But other than that, all the water that falls on the ground has to go somewhere. It can't go into the ground. And this is a map showing for Brooklyn all the impervious surfaces. So all the red is impervious. And so you can see that pretty much the entirety of Brooklyn is all impervious. There's some areas that aren't quite as bad, so this is like Prospect Park here, this is a cemetery here. But most of the water that falls on Brooklyn has to go somewhere that's not into the ground. And so this is kind of the thing that's cited the most. But the other reason that urban areas have a lot of problems with flash flooding is because water is kind of channeled very quickly places. So a natural watershed might look something like this, where you have just kind of a few streams, a stream with a few tributaries coming into it. But then when you get to an urban area, it might look something more like this. Now we have kind of housing developments, big buildings, and each of these have their own pipes that are leading into the streams. And so when that happens, if water falls kind of out here, now it's going to very quickly get routed through a pipe into the stream. So all the water gets into the stream very quickly, which means that all of the water concentrates at the same time, and we get really bad flood peaks. And so to kind of show this in a plot, this is what it looks like. On the left is our kind of natural watershed. We get some rainfall. It slowly rises to our flood peak and then slowly goes back down. And so this is the amount of water in this stream in this plot. So when we go to an urban watershed, now it rains, and not only is there more water to fall, so the volume under our curve is higher, but it also comes out much faster. And so as you can see, as you kind of squeeze this together, it makes the peak go higher. And so now we're going to have a much higher flood peak because the water's coming out faster and there's more water. So flash flooding is bad in cities, and it's probably going to keep getting worse with climate change. And so these are a couple plots from the National Climate Assessment in 2014. And this is showing us how the heaviest 1% of daily precipitation has changed in the last 50 years or so. And it's saying in the Northeast, it's gone up 71%. And this is showing how it might change in the future. And so if we kind of don't reduce our emissions, then it might go up anywhere from 2 to 3%. Okay, so like I said, we have bad flash flooding problems. They're probably going to get worse. So what can we do about it? And that's where I'm really interested in. So there's a few things. The first thing is designing urban areas to handle floods better. So I put here a picture of a detention basin, which is what a lot of my old work looked at. And what a detention basin does is it just detains water for a little bit of time. So in that plot, instead of all of the water coming out at the same time, it'll come out more slowly. And so here you have kind of a pipe leading the water, or you'd have pipes leading the water in here. It stays in this depression, and eventually it'll kind of slowly flow out of this pipe instead of going where it wanted to earlier. We also can warn people about flash floods and be prepared for flash floods. And so here's kind of a National Weather Service campaign saying, turn around, don't drown. So don't be like that car in the picture before. Don't drive through flooded areas. And then we can also think about risk management. And so this is a map that was produced for flooding from sea level rise or flooding from hurricanes. But flooding from rainfall and flash flooding, you can produce similar maps. So we can come up with maps of areas that are more at risk from flooding. And so we can kind of convince people not to live in those areas. Maybe the insurance is really high if you live in a river floodplain or something like that. So there's ways to manage the risks associated with these floods. So how does my research play into that? There's a few ways. The first thing is I'm really interested in studying, how do different areas respond to flash flooding differently? And so looking at particularly differences between different urban watersheds, if there's differences other than just impervious area and why they have flash floods. Then what kind of rainfall leads to flash flooding so we can better predict what's going to happen? And then finally, how can stormwater management, and so this is supposed to be my kind of hand-drawn picture of a detention basin, help us deal with flash flooding and help us mitigate? Okay. So first I'm going to tell you about kind of stuff I've done in the past in Baltimore. I'm going through those three questions of, what are different watershed characteristics, rainfall characteristics, and then what can we build to try to solve this? And then I'm going to look at differences between Baltimore and then moving here towards New York City. And then finally, what does the system in New York City look like? Okay, so first up is Baltimore. So for people who aren't familiar with Baltimore, it's located here in Maryland. It's right on the Chesapeake Bay, is this big inlet of water here. And so the reason that Baltimore is a great place to study some of this stuff is that it was the first long-term ecological research site funded by the NSF that was in an urban area, which basically means that there's just a lot of data there, which is a great thing to have. And so what this plot is showing is kind of that before. The red is more impervious surfaces, or in this case, high-intensity urban surfaces. And then as you go out, this is getting into kind of forested and agricultural land. And these little black lines are showing outlines of different watersheds that I studied in the Baltimore area. And so there's 8 of them, and I'll kind of get into that a little more as we go. But first I want to talk about some of the data we had in Baltimore. So the thing is, when you study flash flooding at all, and especially in urban areas, it's really important to have high-resolution data. And that's because flash floods happen fast, right? That's kind of the definition of what a flash flood is. And so here I'm showing kind of what some of the data looked like. And on the left, this is streamflow. That was taken at 1-minute increments in a Moore's Run watershed, which is about a 10-square-kilometer watershed. And here's one flash flood peak that I studied. And you can see each of these dots is one of these 1-minute readings. So if we had missed even just this one-minute reading, we would have missed this flood peak. If we had been at a 10-minute resolution, we might have thought the flood peak was 700 CFS instead of over 900. So it kind of shows you how important it is to have this really good high-resolution data. And then we also use rainfall fields that are high resolution, so 15-minute, which can't quite reach this 1-minute resolution. And then small spatial resolution as well. So this is an example of a watershed I studied, and then the spatial resolution of the rainfall fields over it to kind of show that, when we're looking at small areas that flash floods happen, and you need your rainfall to be resolved to small areas. Okay, so back to these watersheds. So 8 is too many for you all to remember. But you can kind of see from looking at this figure that we chose watersheds that span the area. So I didn't mention earlier, this gray outline is Baltimore City. And these watersheds go from pretty urban ones, so like number 9 and number 5 here, all the way out to number 1 and number 6 are kind of controls that we don't consider to be urban watersheds at all. So the first question is just, if I look at all of those different watersheds, how do their characteristics determine how flash flooding occurs in those watersheds? So the first thing to look at is just discharge peaks. And so this is, if I look at the stream flow, I can look at what was the highest level that the stream flow reached during the flood. So I look at that for all of these different watersheds, and the first thing that jumps out is that the urban watersheds have worse flood peaks or worse peak discharges. And so you can see all of these on the right side are urban watersheds, and their peak discharges get up pretty high, where these non-urban watersheds have lower peak discharges. And that's pretty much what we would have expected. We can also see that there is one watershed that has a lot of detention basins in it, and that one, the detention basins helped it have kind of a less urban response to flash flooding, or less urban flash flood peaks. Another thing that's interesting, if we go kind of even deeper into the data, is looking at this one watershed called Moore's Run, and it had incredibly high flood peaks. But it didn't really have higher impervious surfaces than the other watersheds. So what's going on in Moore's Run? And this gets back to that idea of watershed density that I mentioned earlier. So Moore's Run was developed kind of earlier than some of the other watersheds, and it has really big storm drain pipes. And so all of the water that gets collected in Moore's Run just goes straight into a huge pipe. Water moves really fast through these pipes. And so all of the water basically just immediately goes to the outlet of Moore's Run, and it gets concentrated very quickly. And so like that plot we saw earlier, that hydrograph is really squeezed, so the peak goes up and up as it's squeezed together, and all the water moves faster and faster. And so this kind of shows us how important development history is in these watersheds. Another thing I'm interested in is runoff ratios in the watershed. So a runoff ratio is how we describe essentially how much water has infiltrated in the watershed. So runoff ratio is if you take the amount of stream flow, so the volume under those curves, and then we divide it by the amount of rainfall. So it's kind of like the percent of water that didn't go into the ground. So the higher the runoff ratio, the lower the infiltration was. And so, again, not surprisingly, the urban watersheds have higher runoff ratios than the non-urban watersheds. Because when you have impervious surfaces, that reduces the infiltration, which means the runoff ratios go up. And kind of interestingly also, the detention basin didn't seem to lower runoff ratios here. And here again, we had kind of one watershed that was really outstanding, which was Dead Run, had very high runoff ratios. So almost 60% of the water that fell eventually ended up in the stream. So what's going on here? Again, Dead Run doesn't have really high impervious surfaces compared to the other watersheds. And so what we think it was is that this is a picture of the Dead Run watershed from Google Earth. And if you look, there's these highways going through Dead Run on the Baltimore Beltway exchange here. And what it does is it makes a lot of connected impervious surface. So the idea is if water lands in one place on an impervious surface, it's possible that it could flow over into a non-impervious surface and infiltrate there. But if it lands on a connected impervious surface, basically the water can flow along the side until it gets into the stream. So there's an idea that it's really important if impervious surfaces are all connected to each other instead of all spread out from each other. So then the final metric we looked at with these watersheds are response times. So response time gets to this idea of how fast water gets out of the watershed. And so if we go back to our picture again of the stream flow coming out of the stream, the response time is from the time that it rains to the time where we hit the peak. How fast is that? So the faster it is, the worse you would expect the flood to be. And so this one was very interesting. These two green ones are the non-urban watersheds, but it turns out that the more detention infrastructure we had in the watershed, and so that's in this column, detention managed area is kind of the percentage of the watershed that has water flowing into detention basins. And if we compare that to the response time, it turns out that the more area, the more detention basins we have in the watershed, the slower the response time is. And so that's something we would expect, because as you detain water, you would expect that the response time should slow down because the water is being detained. All right. So that gives us an idea of what's important for characteristics. How connected is the impervious area? Are there big storm drains that are concentrating water in a detention basins, which I'll get back to in this last point. But now what about the rainfall? So a lot of you guys study weather and things like that. This should be what you care most about, the rainfall. So this is looking at 50 storms that caused floods in these watersheds, and then seeing, when did the storms occur. So at the top I have the kind of non-urban watersheds in a plot, and at the bottom I have the urban watersheds in a plot to see, what storms cause flooding, flash flooding in urban watersheds. And it's pretty apparent that, so this is looking at day of year when the floods occur. The non-urban watersheds kind of have floods consistently throughout the year. But if you look at the urban watersheds, they have a peak, and most of their flash flooding occurs around day 200 of the year, which I used to know what day that actually was. It's sometime in July. It's sometime in the summer. And so what that tells us is that, storms that cause flash flooding in urban watersheds happen in the summer. And so there's warm season thunderstorms, really, is what's causing these flash flooding in urban watersheds, whereas flash flooding in non-urban watersheds happens from a variety of storms. We can go further than that and look what time of day does it happen. And so now this bottom axis is time of day, and so it's hours from 0 UTC, but I also put in Eastern Standard Time here, because I can never remember how to convert back and forth. So here we have about midnight, and here we have about 7 p.m. And so it turns out that, again, we don't see much of a peak in the non-urban watersheds, but in the urban watersheds, flash flooding is happening sometime at night between like 7 and midnight here. There's a big peak. And so now we can kind of get an idea, when do flash floods happen in urban areas? They happen in the summer, in the evenings, or at night. Okay. Another really important factor when thinking about urban areas, flash flooding, rainfall, is that urban areas actually have impacts on the rainfall that falls around them. And so when you start looking at rainfall at kind of small scales, it turns out that most cities have a maximum rainfall area downwind of the city. And so this is for Baltimore. If you look at the top 25 rain days in Baltimore City, so this is saying take this gray box, which is the city, the top 25 days of rainfall in that city, and we map them. It turns out that it actually makes a maximum rainfall, so these rainfall contours of 36 millimeters downwind of the city, not even covering most of the city, which is the area that we were concerned with. And so it's kind of surprising, except that this happens in cities all over the country. So it's been seen in Atlanta, it's been seen in Charlotte, it's been seen in St. Louis. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So we have urban heat island, where the city is hotter than the surroundings, and so it heats up air and lifts it. We have increased cloud condensation nuclei from all of the aerosols put out in urban areas, so there are more clouds over urban areas because of that. And then we also have just roughness from cities, right? So cities have buildings, buildings cause roughness to weather systems moving over it. And so we'll see these maximum rainfall downwind of most cities in the US where we can tell. And then this white arrow is just supposed to show that also the concentration changes really rapidly as you kind of go upwind of the city. So it changes about 0.3 millimeters per kilometer there. So it turns out that this has important impacts on flooding in urban areas. And so now we're going back to kind of showing urban flooding versus the non-urban watersheds flooding. So these top two plots are showing two different urban watersheds, Dead Run and Moore's Run. And these are composites of the rainfall which caused 50 flash floods in these watersheds. And so Dead Run here, you can see there's a maximum rainfall, the red ring around the watershed. But there's also another rainfall maximum in that same place downwind of the city. And then for Moore's Run, you have the same thing. You have a rainfall maximum downwind of the city. Meanwhile, if you look at the non-urban watersheds, or the one with a lot of detention infrastructure, you don't really see that maximum downwind of the city here. You see these maximums up here where there are mountains, which I don't have the topography in this plot, but you can see in this plot there's mountains, the white area here. So it's clear that the storms which are subject to this kind of urban modification are the storms that are flooding the urban watersheds, and not so much the storms that are flooding the non-urban watersheds. And so that makes you wonder, then does this have an impact on kind of our flood risk? If you're downwind of the city, now maybe you have more flash flood risk than someone who lives upwind of the city. And so this is just showing if we take all of these urban watersheds that are downwind of the city and look at the rainfall that causes flash flooding in these watersheds, it turns out, so this is the maximum 1-hour rainfall in these watersheds, because these floods are driven by really short-term rainfall rates. It turns out that, yes, the rainfall in these watersheds is actually very slightly higher than the rainfall that is upwind of the city. And so it does seem like this urban rainfall modification actually can have some role in flood risk. So that kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of how rainfall characteristics in storms impact flash flooding. But now I'm curious and I want to solve this problem. So what can we do with stormwater management infrastructure to help solve these problems? So as I was saying earlier, detention basins we found in some of the earlier studies appear to help a little bit. So detention basins seem to reduce flood peaks, but they don't help water infiltrate. So here's my kind of idea of a graph of what detention basins do. So there's still about the same amount of water under each of these plots, but when you add detention, we move the time out, we increase the response time, and now the flood peak is lower. So our problem's not quite as bad. But this is just from comparing a bunch of different watersheds, and I want to know, what if I had a watershed that either did or didn't have a detention basin? What kind of difference would that make? Because there's actually been other observational studies that suggested that detention basins don't make any difference at all. And so I want to know, what difference do they really make? And what if we kind of move them around? Is there a better way to organize them? And can we do something to make infiltration happen? Because if we infiltrate water, the soil will help kind of treat some of the pathogens and some of the contaminants in the water. So that's good to do also. Okay, so to do this, I modeled one of the watersheds, because the only way we can kind of see what would it be like if reality were different is to make a model. And so this is a small watershed in the area. And the reason I wanted to model this one is because it has a bunch of sub-watersheds. So we had a USGS stream gauge at the outlet, which is called Franklin Town here. But we also had 5 more stream gauges at GR 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so I'm not going to focus that much on this as we go through, because it gets kind of too complex. But what I did is I made a model that was based mostly on what's there, the physics of what's there, and had very little calibration. So here's kind of an overview of what the model is. It's called the Gridded Surface Subsurface Hydrologic Analysis Model, or GEISHA. And it's a distributed hydrologic model. So distributed means that we're able to, it's gridded, and we kind of put information about each grid where it is. So we have all sorts of information in it. Someone was asking me earlier today about, kind of what information do I put into my models. So we have drainage boundaries, so the watershed outline, where all the streams are, where all the pipes are. Elevations, so we know which way water will flow. We have the land use. So land use tells us how rough is the land. It's easier for water to flow over pavement than over grass. Soil type, which tells us how water infiltrates through the soil. And then impervious area, so we know where can water infiltrate at all. And then something that's really important for this model, which some don't do, is we have distributed rainfall. So we're able to have rainfall that varies over the shape, or over the space of the watershed. Okay. And because I'm interested in detention basins, I put in the detention. And so this was a really important aspect of the model. And so what I'm showing here, and all of these colored lines are the streams and the pipes within the watershed. And these black dots are locations of detention basins. And then the size of the gray circle is how much of the watershed area feeds into that detention basin. So you can see, for example, this really big gray circle has all of this stream feeding into it, whereas the small one just has like this tiny bit of stream feeding into it. So it gives you an idea, how much is feeding into it. And that's what these numbers correspond to. So if you look at this whole watershed, about 25% of the watershed is feeding into one of these detention basins instead of just going straight to the outlet. So water will be detained. About 25% of the water should be detained at some point. So if I want to know what difference does detention make, I'll just run the model with the detention and run the model without the detention and see what happens. Okay. So like I said, let's just focus on the outlet instead of kind of all of the sub-basins. But if I take out all the detention and run it, it turns out that what happens is the peak discharges, so the flood peaks, will increase by about 11%. And so it turns out the detention is making a difference. It's not an incredibly large difference, but it's an important difference, 11%. But now I want to have an idea of, it's making a different amount of difference depending on which of these sub-watersheds I looked at. And I want to get an idea of, how efficient is it? So if I put in a new detention basin, is it really worth my while? How efficient is that detention basin? So I made up this measure called detention efficiency. And the idea is if I look at how much did it actually change the flood peak, and then divide that by how much of the watershed is feeding into that detention basin. So the amount of area controlled by that detention basin. And that should give me some idea of how efficient is the detention basin. So here's some numbers. You can tell Franklintown was about 0.45. So that's the outlet of the whole watershed. So the reason I wanted to do this is because I want to see what happens if I move detention basins around. Can I make them more efficient than what they are right now? So to do this, and now we're getting into some kind of deeper hydrology ideas, I made a map of what are the orders of all of the pipes and all of the streams in the watershed. So this is based on a Strahler stream order. So the idea of Strahler stream order is that if you go as upstream as you can with the stream, that will be first order. And so that's all of these red lines are first order. So you can see they all start on their own. And then when you have two first orders meet, it will become second order. So that happens like here, two first orders meet, and now it's second order. When two second orders meet, it'll become third order. Like here, this blue is third order, and on and on. And so it gives you an idea of first order are kind of small, very upstream. Going down to sixth order is very large, near the end of the watershed. And so I use this as a way to organize where the detention basins were, if they're upstream or downstream. So I made a bunch of new scenarios of detention basin layout. So I just kind of randomly placed them along the length of the streams and the pipes. So they were either on the first order stream, so way upstream, second order a little further down, and third order. And just so you kind of have an idea for your own reference, first order would be like if you put a small detention basin kind of capturing water from your house. Second order would be if it's capturing water like, from a store, like a Walmart or a Home Depot or something. And then third order would be more like if it was capturing water from your whole subdivision or from, an area that's multiple stores, so like a mall or something. And that's kind of the size that those are. So I made all of these kind of random scenarios, and then I wanted to compare them to say, if we're in the real world, where's the best place to put these to try to capture water? And so it turns out that first order is not very efficient at all, whereas second and third order are about the same amount of efficient. So if you really want your detention basins to work better for how many you put in, that you should move them downstream a little. And it turns out that if we look at what reality is, and so these two kind of show us what reality is, what is actually there. What's actually there is operating kind of at this 0.5 detention efficiency, where it's possible we could get up to like 1.4-ish. So it turns out that we could really make our systems much more efficient if we kind of planned out our detention basins at the whole watershed scale and moved them downstream a little bit. Okay, but this still isn't going to help us infiltrate water. I'm interested in trying to infiltrate some water because it helps kind of clean up the water that goes through the soil. And so to do this, I focused on the idea of a compacted layer in urban soils. So in a lot of areas that have been built on, soil doesn't look like what you would expect if you just went and dug down. It actually looks something like this. And so you have some little bit of topfill, then you have this layer of soil that's really compacted, so compacted that water can barely get through it. And then you go down and it's kind of normal soil again. And the way this happens is that when people build buildings, they actually intentionally compact the soil so it's more stable and easier to work with. And then they'll put some topfill on top so you can grow grass and things like that, because grass wouldn't be able to grow on this compacted soil. So you'll see this all over if you kind of dig down in urban areas especially. And it restricts the amount of water that can go down into the soil. So even if you don't have pavement, you still can't necessarily get water down through urban areas. And so I included this in my model. There was data on it coming from the Soil Survey Geographic Database, SURGO. So I included it in my model, and then I took out the compacted layer and said, what would happen if we could just get rid of it? Maybe aerate the soil, change the rules so you can't do this when you construct new buildings. And it turns out that it actually, that having this compacted layer there increases flood peaks by about 7%. So remember that detention basins, the difference was about 11%. So this is pretty similar. And if you actually compare the whole distribution of what happens with all the storms when you use the compacted soil versus the detention basins, they're not statistically different. So really, if you could go out and just aerate all the soil in this watershed, it would have just as big of a difference as building detention basins does. So it gives us another idea of possible things we could do in urban areas. So kind of what we got out of all of these Baltimore studies is that there's some important things that are kind of overlooked in urban watersheds, which are that large drain pipes can be very bad for flash flooding and connected impervious areas as well. That summertime thunderstorms are what we really have to worry about for flash flooding, and that they can change the rainfall patterns around urban areas, which can have important implications on risk. If you live downwind of an urban area, you might have more flash flooding there. And that it's important to think about kind of different ways to set up our stormwater infrastructure. That the way we do it right now might not be as efficient as possible. We need to think about it at a larger scale. But that there's other things we can do, like helping to get soil not so compacted and increase infiltration. Okay. So that's all in Baltimore. But now what happens if we start to compare Baltimore to New York City? It's a little different. So this was a study looking at kind of flash flooding across the United States. And so I mentioned earlier, I think flash flooding is really important, but it's kind of overlooked. And so there's no real database you can go and look at that just keeps track of flash flooding or flash flood events. And so I tried to kind of create a way to look at different flash floods across the US. And so this was based on USGS stream gauges across the US and how often they had what I would consider like a flash flood. And so this was based on basically the number of events where the stream flow exceeded 1 cubic meter per second per square kilometer stream flow. So you divide it by the watershed area. So that's kind of complicated, but it's basically saying, how many flash floods are there each year in these watersheds. And so you can see that once you get kind of east in this area, in the I-95 corridor, we like to call it, there's a lot. So the red dots are kind of the most frequent flash floods, and then orange is next. And there's a decent amount all through this area, but you can kind of see from this plot, a lot are in Baltimore, and actually St. Louis also, but not quite as many in New York City. And so we'll see this when we look at a table. This is kind of how flashy are different cities in the US. And so I should caution, this isn't the flashiest cities in the US, this is just all the cities that I kind of had enough data for to put in a table. And so all of these cities had to have at least 3 gauges, and it's not the city proper, it's kind of the census-designated metropolitan area. So New York includes like Newark and Connecticut and a lot of the region, and Baltimore also includes a lot of Maryland. But it turns out that Baltimore is one of the kind of most flash flood prone parts of the country based on my measures. And New York is kind of like average. You can see Baltimore, the mean, so this is kind of the mean flash flood frequency, we could call it. And theirs is about 8.3. And these are kind of small flash floods, what I'm looking at. And then New York, it's only 1.6. So we have less flash flooding problems here, fewer flash flooding problems here. And so there's a few reasons, but one thing that is important is that part of the reason is because there aren't really stream gauges in New York City. There aren't really streams in New York City. So while we can think about, all the floods that happen in Baltimore in pretty urban areas, part of the problem is that in New York, we can't really measure them. And so this is a problem all over the country. If we're thinking about really bad flooding in mountainous areas, we can't really measure that. There's no stream gauges there. So it's important to keep in mind this is only places with stream gauges. But I was also interested, again, in the storms that are causing this as another potential difference. And so these are watersheds that were having these flash flood events. What percentage of these flash flood events are caused by different kinds of storms? And so on the left are thunderstorms, and on the right are tropical cyclones. And so it turns out that thunderstorms are responsible for a lot of them. And so this is kind of anywhere from 60 to 100%, which isn't surprising because those plots I was showing earlier showed that they happen in the summer when we would expect thunderstorms to happen. But one kind of important difference between New York and Baltimore is that you can see, so this is floods driven by tropical cyclones. And so if we look in kind of the New York area, we get a lot of blue color. So it's kind of 0% up to maybe 5%. And if we look down near Baltimore and DC, we get up to kind of yellow. So anywhere up to maybe 25% can be caused by rainfall from tropical cyclones. So there are kind of additional storms that can be causing these floods in the Baltimore area that don't really impact us quite as often in New York. Of course, we do sometimes have tropical cyclones here, but not as frequently. Okay, so that's kind of a basic idea of differences. But New York City is kind of unsurprisingly a very weird place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes on in New York City. Why is it weird to study flash flooding here? Kind of the most important thing to know about New York City, if you're starting to think about flooding and where water goes, is that New York City has combined sewer systems. So in most places in the US, especially newer places, you have separate sewer systems. And so a separate sewer system means, here's your houses, and when you flush the toilet, take a shower, water goes out, it goes down a sanitary sewer pipe. The sanitary sewer pipe, which is brown in my picture here, goes to this wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater treatment plant treats the sewage and then puts it out into a stream or a lake or wherever. On the other hand, if it rains and you get storm water, it runs off and it gets collected, say, on the side of the street by just a stormwater pipe. And so this blue represents kind of a stormwater pipe, collects the water, and then it just goes straight into the stream because it's just water. Okay, and so those are two separate pipes. Now, in New York City and a lot of older cities, we have combined sewer systems. So what happens here is that those same sanitary sewers that collect waste from your house also collect the stormwater from the streets. And so all of the water that falls on the street has to go through the sanitary sewer pipes, get treated in the wastewater treatment plant before it goes out to the stream. So you can imagine, sometimes there's a lot of water that has to go get treated by the wastewater treatment plant. So this has an important impact on how we kind of categorize things hydrologically. So normally we think about watersheds. So this was the watershed that I modeled, the dead run watershed. And you can see it's kind of a weird shape because it's defined by what are the elevations around. So if water flows from here down to the stream outlet, it's because it's higher here, water flows downhill. In New York City, so this is the Gowanus Canal watershed. It's not really a watershed, it's a sewer shed. It's not really determined by elevation at all. It's determined by where they built the sewer pipes. So sewer pipes lead from all of these areas into this blue canal here. And you can see that's why we have like straight lines, because they're going down streets. You wouldn't see straight lines in kind of a natural elevation system. And so it's just a completely different system. It's completely engineered. I mean, the Gowanus Canal, of course, is engineered itself. And so it's a very different system to begin thinking about. Now, there's also problems with combined sewers that a lot of cities are dealing with right now, especially New York City. So sometimes it rains a lot, right? What happens when it rains a lot? In a normal city, maybe the storm sewers get backed up. In New York City or another city with combined sewers, it turns out that sometimes it rains so much, the wastewater treatment plant can't treat all of this rainwater that's coming in. So it has a bypass. And so sometimes some of this water will just go directly into the stream untreated. because it rains so much we can't treat it all. So now we have raw sewage and stormwater going into the streams or going into the river. And so this is pretty bad. I mean, it's diluted by the stormwater, but it's still not really something that we want. So it happens a lot in New York City, actually. So here's a plot showing all of these dots, and this comes from the New York Times, not from me. All of these dots are different combined sewer overflows, they call them, where combined sewers just dump sewage and stormwater into natural water bodies. And then the size of the dot tells you about how much. And so these big dots are 2 billion gallons a year of sewage and stormwater going straight into the East River here. Or straight into Jamaica Bay or wherever. So there's a lot, I mean, billions and billions of gallons a year that New York City is dumping straight into natural water bodies. So it's not a good thing. And it's not just us who think it's a bad thing. The EPA thinks it's a bad thing, too. I'll come back to that in a second. I guess I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So we'll come back to how they're trying to deal with that. New York City basically has gotten in trouble with the EPA, as a lot of places have, and has been forced to find a way to deal with it. But that's not the only thing that happens when it rains too much. They also have flash flooding in New York City. And so this is something that the city doesn't worry about that much. It hasn't really been thought about very much at all. But what this map is a map of complaints, of when people call like the local complaint hotline and say, there's water in the street, there's water in my basement. The red dots are basement and the blue dots are the street. It's tough because in Baltimore it's very easy to go and say, this stream gauge said it flooded, it flooded. In New York there are no streams. A lot of these pipes and stuff don't have any gauges, or if they do, the city doesn't want to give you the data. So you have to kind of come up with new ways to figure out, did it flood? Which sounds crazy because you should know, if it flooded, there's water there, but you can't watch everywhere. And so this is one way you can start thinking about, did it flood? Well, New Yorkers like to complain, right? So if they called 311 and said, hey, there's water in the street, that's a good indication, well, it flooded that day. And so this is for a couple years. But you can see, it definitely does flood in the streets in New York City. And it is a problem. They're not really addressing it yet, but it's something to think about. Okay. But back to the rainfall, since I'm going to kind of follow the same pattern here. So talked about what's going on there. Now the rainfall. We're still kind of trying to put together what does the rainfall look like over New York City. This was a paper that had kind of a different aim, looking at storm tracking, but they did look at the average rainfall for some high convection days over New York City. And so this is kind of the outline of New York City, though I don't know like what these arms are doing here. But we can see that there is kind of a downwind rainfall maximum like we've seen in other areas. It's kind of over Westchester. So it's outside of the city. But it's also interesting to note that the rainfall is substantially less than it was in Baltimore. In Baltimore, it was like 36 millimeters. Here, it's 22 millimeters. Now, this is based on amount of lightning strikes to pick the days instead of amount of rainfall, so that could account for part of it. But it does have, New York City does have less extreme rainfall on a regular basis than Baltimore, I think, is part of the difference in flash flooding in the areas. Okay, so I was saying New York City discharges a lot of sewage straight out to the Jamaica Bay, the Hudson River, the East River. So New York City got in trouble with the EPA. They have to do something about it. And so they kind of came up with this agreement that what they would do about it is they would build green infrastructure. So here's kind of a picture of what green infrastructure is. The idea is that water runs down the street and it will kind of enter in these curb cuts into these little, they'll call them like bioswales or something, a little area that it can infiltrate into on the side of the street. And then if there's too much, it could run back out the other side. And this is supposed to take really substantial amounts of water and keep them from going out into the sewers and causing combined sewer overflows. So this is what they're doing. It's kind of a tough situation because I studied detention basins in the past as an important way to prevent flooding, you can't really build detention basins in a lot of New York City, right? We don't have open land and open grass. The area that a detention basin takes up in Manhattan, you could build a $1 billion building there or something. So they've been building these. And so this is a map showing kind of all of the places that they're building them. And so something you could maybe notice from this map is that they don't have as many in kind of Manhattan or like closer parts of Brooklyn. A lot of them in outer parts of Queens. So part of it has to do with where they can find land to do it. They're also kind of basing it on putting it in areas that don't already have some green space. So places that already have lots of nice trees and stuff, they're not as interested in providing plants and stuff. So it's partially a social program as well. But so this is what they're really focused on. This is going to be kind of their plan to solve the problems. So it's unclear how much it's going to solve the problems, but this is what they're doing there. So, I'm interested in seeing how it'll work. I don't know how it'll work, but that's what's going on at least. So thank you for listening. Thanks for having me. And so those are just kind of my collaborators on some of the work.
Great. Very interesting presentation. Questions for Brianne?
I have a
Yep.
couple of those bioswales. How do you build up a sense of social pride for people who look after them? Because,
Yeah.
I get to work with a lot of children who live there. And some areas are good for some unfit human habitation. So
Yeah, so it's a big problem. I'm part of a group that's looking at kind of like pilot studies they did with them, and they started them years ago, and I think 10 years ago. And so we went out recently and looked at a bunch of them, and a lot, maintenance is a really huge issue because people just come by and they throw garbage in them. They see, like, I think something about the railings makes them think, like, I can throw my garbage here. So it's a big issue. They have to have people come out, weekly and pull the garbage out, but then they rake the soil, and then the soil gets compacted, and it doesn't infiltrate as much. So it's a very big issue. We saw one that was in an area with kind of freestanding houses, so further out in Queens, and someone had actually pulled the plants out that were there and planted their own, like, rose bushes, and just, like, perfectly taken care of. No one ever has to maintain it because the person who lives there maintains it because it's, like, their property, they think of it as. So I think it's a really fascinating thing that hopefully we can get kind of sociologists to study. I mean, it's outside of my expertise. There's obviously something there that's very important, and it would be much easier, for the city, I'm sure, if they could put it in areas where people will kind of maintain it instead of throwing garbage in it. But it's a really big issue. A lot of them have garbage thrown in them.
another quick question,
Mhm.
sort of technical question. You talk
Yeah.
about detention.
Mhm.
You didn't talk about retention. It seems to me like detention is like you're locking something up like you're in jail.
Right.
Retention is that you're held up at Kennedy Airport Customs because you have snails in your backpack, but they let you go.
Right. So there's two different ideas. There's detention and retention, and I hope I get them right because I feel like people use them differently. The idea generally is detention. You detain the water, but let's see if I can find this. So I actually tried to put. So this was coming from a different presentation, and in my kind of silly image here, I had put this kind of like brown, it's supposed to be a liner. So usually when you put in detention basins, the idea is you're only detaining the water. So you actually put in like a liner here so the water won't infiltrate. Whereas retention basins, they have kind of the same idea of like you detain the water for a while and then eventually you let it flow out. So you can see also kind of this pipe that's leading in is bigger than the pipe leading out, with the idea the water comes out more slowly than it goes in and it gets backed up. Whereas a retention basin generally wouldn't have this liner, would be the main difference. So the water will slowly leak out, but it will also infiltrate. So you'll lose it both ways. And so in a lot of ways, retention is more the way of the future. So like green infrastructure is what people like now. They want water to get kind of clean, go back down into the ground. So retention is more similar to that. There's big there's big ideas over kind of gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure. So detention basins are definitely gray infrastructure, like pipes and basins and liners, instead of like green infrastructure. The idea is like go back towards a natural system, which in New York City, I mean, you can't go back to a natural system, but it's kind of the way of the future right now, I guess.
Yeah, the table to compare Baltimore and New York is based upon the stream gateway wondering if there's a similar table based upon the radar rainfall data.
This table? So this is based on USGS stream gauges.
Right.
This is based on how high flood peaks are in stream gauges. For radars and stuff, not that I'm aware of. I mean, there's unfortunately very few studies of kind of flash flood occurrence. There's been a few by USGS folks. There's a guy at the Severe Storms Lab who's trying to make like kind of online databases that are accessible, where you can look up and you can get a lot of ideas about where they happened in GIS. But unfortunately, there's just not a lot of data about when did a flash flood happen, how bad was it. It's hard to compile.
I was curious, what's the state of the art in terms of New York City? No one's really modeled this to the detail like what you did in Baltimore with considering the new stuff.
So as far as I know, there have been some models that use kind of hydraulic models, which are just kind of like pipes, but maybe not as high resolution rainfall data, maybe like a design storm or something. But it's mostly consulting companies hired by the city to do like long-term control plans, which is part of this like green infrastructure movement. So like this sewer shed that feeds into a certain wastewater treatment plant, we need to make a plan for the future. So let's say we put in this green infrastructure, then model like how it will change. But the problem is there aren't really measurements to go along with it, and then the models are a little bit simple and more kind of, they're consulting company models.
So if we got, as you're probably aware, we had this 10-inch rainfall or 15-inch rainfall in an hour or so at Islip a couple of years ago. And so if that happened over New York City, do we have any understanding of what could happen if we had that kind of rainfall rate where, basically, is anyone that thinking about that? Or
I hope to think about that kind of thing, but right now, not that I'm aware of. I think all of the city programs are very focused on rainfalls less than 1 inch, because they say most of their rainfalls are less than 1 inch. That's what they're concerned with. And they're not really thinking about what happens more than 1 inch. Certainly not 10 inches.
Any other questions?
All right. So if, say, somebody came up with a lot of money and say, I want to help you with the New York City and try and disentangle this combined sewer issue, how would you go about your advice? Would it make sense to have a different system?
To separate? I'm not sure that so I know that there's a program in Staten Island where they did start separating the sewers. I mean, New York City, I don't think that's possible. It's all underground. It's all tough. In a lot of places, they just need to replace the sewers that are already there, even, and there's no money to do that. And it's not just New York City. So even like downtown Baltimore has combined sewers also, but we didn't work in that area because it's hard to figure out what to do there. So I'm not sure that separating the sewers is a good idea. If I had to guess right now, kind of before getting into modeling it, it's not popular, but I think underground water storage tanks are probably a good option. But like I said, people right now don't like gray infrastructure, and that's a very gray infrastructure. But green infrastructure, as you can see, these little side of the street things can't hold very much water. So, yeah.
Barbara.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if part of the green infrastructure movement, and at least on Long Island, too, people having rain gardens and rain barrels also.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's been used in New York City or things that are up on the roof.
Yeah, they're putting in green roofs. So the DEP has a big program where they'll pay, developers can put in a green roof and actually get reimbursed for putting in the green roof. So there's a big system going on with that as well. And so that can help with some water. I think green roofs make a much bigger difference in terms of like cooling and making a big difference with urban heat island stuff. But they can hold a little bit of water. But again, not 10 inches. Yeah.
Last question. No.
Thinking down the road, 25, 50 years, 100 years from now, we know sea levels rising present about 1 foot every century, but that's expected to accelerate. And all these combined sewer overflows, I think there's a total of about 770. think the picture in the New York Times showed the big ones.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are at or below high tide level at the moment. So, are you or others looking at the effects of sea level rise that's going to have all these backups?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not something I've thought about much yet, but it's certainly going to be a problem. And I wonder as well, you know, even once you get that much sea level rise, some of the wastewater treatment plants are going to have trouble as well, right, where their outflows are. That's something that is kind of even beyond what I can worry about right now, I would say. But it's definitely a problem people should be thinking about. Some cities are starting to do huge things, like Chicago is actually, they have trouble with the Chicago River getting too much water because there's complicated, the Chicago River flow direction got reversed, and if it gets too much water in it, then it'll go back the way it naturally goes. And so they're actually building, they call it like the Deep Tunnel Project, an enormous water storage tank under the Chicago River to hold all of the stormwater runoff they don't want going into the Chicago River. And so I honestly think if you're very serious about like what are we going to do to prevent this sort of thing, you just have to start thinking about enormous gray solutions like that.
There's a big sewage treatment plant in Nassau County called Bay Park,
Mhm.
destroyed by Sandy.
Right.
You know, and it's a problem there also. It's so close to sea level.
Right. And what happens when it's underwater or close to underwater? Yeah, I don't know. It's a big problem.
Plenty of things to work on.
Yeah.
So, let's keep Brianne moving. So join us for lunch down the hall. No.